مساء الخير للجميع، يعطيكم العافية. أنا اسمي حسام زملط، مدير معهد بيرزيت للإدارة الحكومية، وبتشرف كثير اليوم أني أترأس هاي الجلسة لسببين. السبب الأول هو أهمية وخصوصية المحاضر، وهو سلطة كونية عالمية في مجال تخصصه، وأيضا بتشرف أن تكون هاي المحاضرة وهذا النشاط هي بكورة أعمال معهد بيرزيت للإدارة الحكومية التابع لكلية الحقوق والإدارة العامة في جامعة بيرزيت. وقبل ما أنتقل إلى المحاضرة والمحاضر، حابب أحكي لكم في بشكل سريع عن معهد بيرزيت للإدارة الحكومية، كون هاي هو نشاطه الأول. هذا المعهد هو باختصار مساهمة جامعة بيرزيت في الوصل بين الأكاديمية والمساحة العامة، بمعنى هي همزة الوصل بين المعرفة وصناعة القرار. وهي معهد بيرزيت للإدارة الحكومية المكان الذي تصبو من خلاله الجامعة إلى تخريج قيادة المستقبل في المؤسسات العامة المختلفة. وهذا المعهد سيكون له 4 أعمدة أساسية. الأول هو التدريس والتعليم، وسيكون هناك برنامج ماجستير في الإدارة الحكومية والحكومة الحكومات المحلية. والمعهد بالتعاون مع كلية الحقوق ضالع في البدء في تدريس هذا الماجستير. العمود الثاني أو الأساس الثاني هو الأساس التدريبي، ويختلف عن التدريس الأكاديمي. تدريب الكوادر المختلفة في المؤسسات الحكومية والعامة وحتى الخاصة في مجالات مخصصة بالإدارة الحكومية بشكل عام. وسيكون هناك برنامج تدريبي مكثف بمناهج مختلفة يستفيد من تجارب آخرين حول العالم. الثالث هو البحث، وبحث مدارس الإدارات الحكومية بحث مختلف عن الأبحاث الأكاديمية، هو policy research، أي أبحاث سياسات معنية بالأساس بترجمة المعرفة إلى أوراق قادرة على إفادة صانع القرار في المجالات المختلفة، وبالتالي هي أبحاث أكثر موجهة باتجاه صناعة القرار والمساهمة في الحيز العام والنقاش العام. والرابع والأخير هو هذا المنبر. نحن نريد أن نفتح في هذا المعهد منبر لنقاش القضايا العامة دائما كما نفعل الآن، وهي قضايا عامة مهمة الذي سيتناقش فيها الأستاذ دافيد ليون. دعني أنتقل بسرعة إلى المحاضرة. ومحاضرتنا اليوم هي بعنوان الحكومة، الأعمال التجارية وقوة المعلومات والبيانات، الاتجاهات الرئيسية في تطور منظومات الرصد والمراقبة المعاصرة. أنتم جميعا طلاب في مجالات مختلفة، ولكن عالمنا اليوم حقيقة محكوم في قضايا نظم المعلومات والمراقبة المعاصرة. ولا أستطيع أن أقول أهمية هذا المجال الذي للأسف ليس له تركيز مباشر لدينا في فلسطين، ونحن نتعرض له إما سلبا أو إيجابا بشكل يومي، قضية الرصد وتجميع المعلومات وما شابه. وسيلقي هذه المحاضرة البروفيسور والخبير الدولي دافيد ليون، وهو مدير مركز دراسات المراقبة في جامعة كوينز بكندا، وأستاذ العلوم الاجتماعية والقانون. أيضا البروفيسور ليون باحثا رئيسيا لمشروع الشفافية الجديد The New Transparency Project، وهو كان زميل بحث لزمالة كيلا من عام 2008 ل 2010 حول عولمة أنظمة بطاقات الهوية الID cards. ستناقش هذه المحاضرة الاتجاهات الرئيسية لشبكات الرصد والمراقبة، والتي اتسمنا بالتوسع والتمدد الدائم في العقدين الأخيرين. وعليه سيستعرض الباحث 9 اتجاهات واضحة في شبكات المراقبة، وسيتبين الكيفية التي تؤثر فيها طرق معالجة البيانات الشخصية على فرصنا كأشخاص ومؤسسات، واختياراتنا سواء كانت بطريقة مباشرة أو غير مباشرة. كما ستلخص هذه المحاضرة باقتراح بعض التوصيات للمواطنين الراغبين في تحدي المراقبة الشاملة. أيضا قبل أن أنتقل إلى السيد بروفيسور ليون، أود الإعلان لكم أنه ستكون هناك سلسلة من المحاضرات العامة يلقيها البروفيسور ليون. هذه هي بكورة هذه المحاضرات الأولى. المحاضرة الثانية ستكون يوم الثلاثاء القادم 10 من آذار، أيضا في نفس الساعة 2 إلى 3:30 بعنوان الصواب والخطأ في الرصد والمراقبة، الأخلاق، الحريات المدنية والكرامة الإنسانية. المحاضرة الثالثة ستكون الثلاثاء 17 آذار 2 إلى 3:30 بعنوان الرصد والمراقبة في السياقات الاستعمارية، كيف يتم الحفاظ على القوة ومنظومات السيطرة بواسطة إدارة الإبصار والرؤية. وأتمنى حضوركم لهذه المحاضرات جميعا. والآن لن أخذ وقتا أطول من ذلك إلى البروفيسور ليون الذي سيتحدث لمدة ساعة حول موضوعه، ثم سنفتح النقاش بعد ذلك لمدة نصف ساعة. فليتفضل بروفيسور ليون مشكورا.
Thank you very much indeed for your welcome. It's a privilege to be here, and we're happy to be your guests. I'm here with my wife, and I'm on sabbatical leave from my university, Queen's, in Kingston, Ontario. My wife, Sue, is a potter. She makes pottery, and that is what she does for a living, but it also means that she is flexible with her timetable, and so she chooses not to have students learning from her when we have the chance to travel together. So we go to on our sabbatical trips together, and the one important thing is that we like to be in Canada for our grandchildren's birthdays. So as long as we don't miss the grandchildren birthdays, then we are okay. So I should apologize for the fact that I do not speak Arabic, and I realize that this is a disadvantage, but I hope that we'll be able to communicate together nonetheless. Now, the ways in which I shall be speaking about surveillance, really this is the first presentation, and it introduces some of the later ones. So although we can come back to some of the ideas that I'll be mentioning, really this is an introduction also for what follows. So I should start by saying something about how I understand surveillance. What is surveillance that I'm talking about? And of course, I have to admit that this is embarrassing for me, because I need you to teach me what surveillance is all about, practically speaking. I do not experience surveillance in quite such a direct and visceral way as I know that you do. So I'm hoping that I will be able to learn from you. But I can tell you a few things about what I have learned about surveillance over the past 25 years or so. I'm not an expert on the Middle East either, and therefore, again, I need to learn from you about aspects of surveillance that are peculiar to your circumstances, and again, ones that I don't necessarily have in the same way. Now, I began to see the importance of surveillance not through studying activities of government or corporations, but I started seeing the importance of surveillance in the 1980s, when I was trying to understand what at that time was called the information revolution. And so it was through the sociology of new technologies that I began to see that there were questions that we couldn't really answer from within the social sciences about surveillance. And so from that time, the mid-1980s, I started more serious research and study of what surveillance might entail as the capacities for new computing technologies and storage of personal data was allowing for a whole new way of really organizing and ordering social life. I didn't come to that conclusion at the beginning. Now, I think it is a tremendously important area for us to understand how contemporary life is organized. So what I began to see was the ways in which the new technologies were being used, new technologies of data management, and from that forms of administration and control became increasingly possible in the later part of the last century. But once I started thinking about how this worked, of course my mind became more historically oriented, and I tried to understand where it had come from. My PhD was actually in history, from a history department, and so I was always inclined to look back to see what the origins of the contemporary forms of surveillance were. And so from that I started to realize just how deeply rooted within the modern world, within modernity, are the institutions and processes of surveillance. So now, today, I see surveillance as part of what is centrally important for political and economic life. Now, a leading figure in the field, Ajahn Appadurai, says that the nation state works by policing borders, by producing citizens, and by defining the capitals of the nation state, its monuments, its cities, its water, and its soils, and by constructing the locales of its memory and commemoration. Things such as graveyards, things such as museums are all important. And in that phrase from Appadurai, I see surveillance written very large in a number of different contexts. The ways in which citizens are made up. How do you make a citizen? This is a surveillance question. How do you police a border? Crossing the Allenby Bridge yesterday, I discovered several things about border policing from experience. And I could see that the many people with me were having similar sense of the experience through which there was going. I found it to be a very tense border. I had not previously crossed the King Hussein Bridge from Jordan to what is called the Allenby Bridge on this side before. So that experience reminds me about the importance of policing borders. It's a surveillance experience from start to finish. And then also there is the question of how the nation state uses population statistics, the census, the ways in which information is collected, how populations are numbered or enumerated in order to facilitate administrative control. This is also surveillance. So in all these ways, we find, in this case, the nation state involved in surveillance. Although one of the things that I want to say this afternoon is that it is not only the nation state. We mentioned Big Brother in the introduction. When George Orwell wrote his book, 1984, he had only the nation state in mind. That's what he was writing about. Today, surveillance does not only exist within the nation state. It has become a generalized process within contemporary modern society. Very important, and we're going to come to that as we go along. So, for me, understanding surveillance then, I think of it as the focused, routine, and systematic attention to personal details. That's what I'm thinking of as surveillance. Focused, routine, systematic attention to personal details. But of course that's not enough for a definition, because we need to say why those things are being attended to so carefully. So I think of many purposes for surveillance. It may be for protection. It may be for control, or influence, or entitlement, perhaps most generally monitoring. So, management, in which case we could say that in a brief definition, surveillance is monitoring for management. There has to be a purpose for the watching or the taking note of the personal details. Otherwise, it is a different kind of watching or a different kind of attention. It has to be a gaze rather than just a glance. It has to be purposeful. So that's how I understand what we are talking about in the realm of surveillance. And of course, all kinds of things can be surveilled. It can be actions that we perform. It can be images of our features. It can be places where we visit, exchanges that we make, communications that we have with others. Very importantly, surveillance tries to capture the time and the place. And you can tell, if you're in the social sciences at least, or history included, that once we have a sense of time and place, then you have the two key coordinates for human social life. And surveillance is involved in both that timing and that placing. So from the point of view of power and of relationship, it is critical that we see that surveillance has to do with time and place. It may also have to do with those with whom we associate. So the surveillance may be of others in order to find out about us and who we are. And things like Facebook are an obvious example of how organizations find out about me through knowing who my friends are. So it doesn't just depend on surveillance of me, but surveillance of those with whom I associate or with whom I have a relationship. So surveillance can be of many things, and the more things that are under surveillance, the more surveillance will be effective. But I already said that we are not only dealing with state surveillance or nation-state surveillance. Very important to remember this. It is also in the realm predominantly of the economy as well as the nation-state. And I'm going to say more about that, as I say, in a moment. I also want to point out that surveillance is always ambiguous. It isn't a straightforwardly wonderful thing to which we look for efficient management, nor is it a negative and sinister thing in its own right. I don't believe it's helpful to look at it simply in terms of good or bad, negative or positive. On the other hand, I do want to argue that surveillance is never, ever neutral. There is no surveillance activity that somehow is neutral. It is always subject to ethical assessment and to political contestation. Whatever it is subject to those. So, never neutral, always contestable, always to be assessed. And here's another important thing if we're trying to establish what surveillance is. It always involves some kind of sorting into categories. It has to do with the classification of different groups within the population. Again, we can't stress this too much. It has always been a classificatory process. And the idea of that classification is so that different groups within a population can be treated differently. And that too might have very beneficial or very, very negative connotations attached to it. It could be beneficial, for example, in the case of public health surveillance. It may be that to discover that within some groups in the population there is a tendency for greater liability that you will have some kind of disease at some point in life. So from the public health point of view, there may be ways in which dividing the population into categories helps us to focus medical and epidemiological attention on certain categories in the population. That too, of course, may be questionable from some points of view. However, it's a potentially positive way of thinking about some aspects of surveillance. On the other hand, it may be a way the division into different groups so they can be treated differently may be the way of treating certain groups as other that are highly negative and which may lead to systematic disadvantage to those groups who are thus othered. And again, we can look further at that question, but the sorting issue is vital. Categorization for different treatment is crucial. Ian Hacking, who is, again, a leading figure in this area, says that the technologies for classifying and enumerating are crucial to modernity, to the modern world. And they are important for bureaucracies and bureaucratic administration, and for the ways in which those bureaucracies continue and have an ongoing life, regardless of who at any time is an official within them. This is the kind of thing that Max Weber wrote about. And so the authority and the continuity of the bureaucracy is dependent upon those technologies for organizing data and for classifying different groups. Categories are invented in order to capture particular kinds of data. And so we end up being able to describe a society in terms of the way that we have categorized it for bureaucratic purposes. It leads to our conceiving a society in a particular way. The size of minorities within a given population, for example, will be a way of saying what sort of a society we inhabit. It may end up helping us to describe who is our neighbor in terms of those classifications that are produced by the administrative machinery. So it's a very deeply rooted form of, if you like, cultural imagination that develops from those, in this case, nation-state kinds of practices. And so the same Ian Hacking says that systematic data collection has transformed what we choose to do, who we try to be, and what we think of ourselves. Now, those are pretty profound statements, really, about something that I'm calling surveillance this afternoon. Surveillance contributes to and has transformed historically what we choose to do, who we try to be, and what we think of ourselves. And another way of saying that, as I would put it, would be that surveillance helps to determine our life chances and our choices in today's world. It has become a critical means of organizing relationships and distributing power in ways that transcend what previously happened in earlier eras, before the modern era. Of course, surveillance has always been with us in one form or another, but as a central organizing feature, this is a characteristic of whatever we call today late modernity, or some term like that. Now, all this, I'm aware, has local resonance, and I hope that you can hear it in terms of your own cultural experiences. As I say, I want to learn from you on this matter, and so I'm not going to pretend that I know. But my colleague Ilya Zurich argues that official statistics and enumeration practices have been important in this part of the world for a very long time. Not just since 1948, but way back to Ottoman Empire times. And through such administrative practices, surveillance has been important in this part of the world, at least since the mid-19th century. After 1948, as Anat Libler says, the modern state needs national statistics to create citizens, and the statistics need the authority of the state to practice their profession. And so she's arguing in that particular article that in the case of the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics, they always, right from the foundation of that bureau, worked very closely hand in hand with the Israeli state administration, so that the one needed the other, and they worked together. And I can give you the reference for that article if you wish. So what are we saying about surveillance as a form of rational and bureaucratic management? The state, in this case, is clearly a key player for things like the census that I mentioned, for registration of births, marriages, deaths, and so on, for taxation, for conscription. All these I would read as forms of surveillance. It's also important for policing and for intelligence. The talk I'm giving on Thursday is about surveillance after the revelations of Edward Snowden in 2013. And that's where the intelligence gathering is particularly important. But it's also the case that in the modern world, Western states have frequently tested their surveillance apparatus in colonial contexts. And that too is very important, I believe, and I believe my colleague Ilya Zurich, who has taught me a lot about this, very important in this part of the world too. I have a PhD student back at Queen's, and she's Japanese, and she was raised in Yokohama and now lives in Fukuoka. And her PhD work is on the ways in which the Japanese state tested new surveillance systems, including identification systems especially, in Manchuria, in China, during the 1930s and early 1940s. And they were testing a system that in fact was then taken back to Japan and has developed there into the contemporary Japanese identification system, which is called JukiNet. To take another case, in the United States. United States activities, United States adventures in the Philippines led to the foundation of a state security organization. And in that state security organization in the Philippines was tested a system that would eventually be used back in the United States, the Central Intelligence Agency. So the CIA in the US today was originally tested in what is really a colonial context of the Philippines and local administration in the Philippines. So there's just a couple of examples of what I mean by colonial administrations testing their surveillance capabilities and systems in colonial contexts, and in this case then reusing them in the home country or the mother country. Bit of an insult to mothers to use that term in that context, but I guess that is a common phrase. The implications of what I've just been saying for the situation here, I think will be evident to you, but we will be looking at them in the third of the 3 lectures that were mentioned earlier. But it's not only the nation state, it's also in the economic sphere that we see modernity developing forms of surveillance. So if you switch out of the sphere of the nation state and think for a moment about the ways in which the workplace is organized, we see there too the development of rational bureaucratic mentality in organizing workforces. So that in the 19th century you have rudimentary forms of organizing capitalist workplaces in particular. By the 20th century, new technologies, new techniques are being used. And especially we see it in the development in the West of what was called Taylorism. So Taylorism was a system of rationally organizing the management of work crews in both manufacturing and in administrative kinds of activities. And in that case too, Taylorism in particular broke down the tasks that had to be performed by the worker into their little segments and started to enumerate, classify different sorts of behaviors that were required for the workplace. And so we see in Taylorism also a very important form of surveillance, trying to increase the efficiency of the workplace and of course to extract maximum value from those individual workers, now classified into groups and whose activities are also classified into groups of tasks that had to be performed according to place and time. Again, the time-space coordinates in this form of surveillance are also crucially important. But it's not only in the economic sphere of production, but the sphere of consumption where surveillance is also highly visible. Again, important to think about this. So, from the late 19th century, and certainly my friends in the West are also always surprised when I suggest that the surveillance of the consumer is a 19th century activity and not just a 20th century activity. Very important to see in the late part of the 19th century, consumer surveillance becoming increasingly important in a number of different countries. How this was carried out was when department stores were invented, where you had many different kinds of things being sold under one roof. So they also started keeping records on consumers. So in these days, it would have been in large ledgers, big books with many handwritten details of consumers. So what sorts of things consumers bought, how much they were willing to pay, how frequently they would buy certain products. All these things were recorded. The consumers didn't know that their activities were being recorded, but they were. And so by the early 20th century, there was a sophisticated form of consumer surveillance developing in a number of countries, especially the more advanced capitalist societies. So consumer surveillance, also very important indeed. And it was also supported by early evidence-producing technologies. So if you think that the internet or the cell phone is a means of producing evidence about your activities, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the telegraph, the telephone, the camera, the typewriter, the phonograph, all these technologies were what Josh Lauer calls evidence-producing technologies. You could find out more effectively, in other words, you could do surveillance more effectively with a telephone, a typewriter, a camera, and so on. So very important not to think of computers as being the thing that enables surveillance. Pre-computer surveillance is tremendously important. And really what computer-based surveillance, or today digital surveillance, does is take what was previously there and upgrade it. It was not an invention. Surveillance was not an invention of the world of computing and modern telecommunications. It was already there. So very important to get that historical dimension, because it raises all kinds of questions that we cannot understand if we think only in terms of the digital. So consumer surveillance, crucial. By the late 20th century, of course, this was very sophisticated and became something that was using the new computer technologies, what is called geodemographic. So demographic, population counting, geo relating to where those people were, geodemographic forms of consumer surveillance had become very important. Based in the United States, which was where it was pioneered, on the zip code, the postal code. So the assumption was that you could start to classify populations on the basis of zip code, similar people living in similar areas. But that classification started to define what those areas were. And in the age of interactive media that we have today, you discover that people go to those forms of geodemographic consumer surveillance in order to try to better themselves. So it becomes something that is at first established out there, and a system classifies us in a particular way, but then you discover that ordinary people in everyday life start to accept the classification and enter into it and become part of the system that originally classified them in ways that might have been quite alien to their understanding of who they are. Remember the phrase that I mentioned early on about how we see ourselves as a society, how we describe our neighbor? If you think about describing somebody in terms of their zip code or their telephone area code, you can see the kind of thing that I'm meaning. It touches all of our lives when we see how that has become part of our mentalité, part of the way that we think of ourselves. So again, I want to stress how that kind of culture of surveillance has become something that we ourselves imbibe. It becomes part of us, not just something that is done to us. And so at last we come back to those digital technologies, and we see that a tremendous, especially it helps to emphasize the remote, the abstract, the technical form of control. It focuses less and less on the actual everyday lives of people and more on fragments of data that are supposedly, by the system, attached to that person. It also means that the use of digital technologies also means that the data flow much more easily. If you have those big ledgers of consumer data that are handwritten, it's very difficult to transfer those data to some other context. Even in the early 20th century, police departments sometimes looked to the department stores to give them information about specific consumers. But it's very difficult to transfer those data from the handwritten ledger into the police notebook. Today, it happens instantaneously and with great ease that data collected for one purpose gets used for another. And this creates a huge challenge for contemporary surveillance and for the limits that have to be put on such surveillance if we are not to live in a very undesirable society. So that flowing of data from one area to another is part of what I think of as the liquefying of surveillance. It becomes liquid. A few years ago I had a conversation with Zygmunt Bauman, and we talked about the ways in which his ideas about the liquid society are very obvious in the world of surveillance. And that liquid surveillance is something that I think we have to bear in mind. The surveillance culture, too, is something that I think is tremendously important, where we start to accept the data image provided to us by whatever surveillance agency it may be, whether from the nation state or from workplace surveillance or from consumer surveillance, and especially from consumer surveillance. We may rely on that construction of ourselves by those surveillance media. You go to Amazon.com and, oh my goodness, if I had known that that book was already published, I didn't even know there was a book about that. It's perfect for me. This is great. I need to go back to Amazon because Amazon obviously knows me better than I know myself. I can understand what sort of a person I am from what they think I should read next. Perfect. It takes so much, effort out of everyday living to have Amazon help me understand who I am. It's great. But you see what I'm saying? The way in which the system defines us, we can so easily start to accept as if it were somehow an accurate representation of who we are and who we want to be and what kind of society we live in. So the surveillance culture aspect of what is happening, I think, is tremendously important. We may even end up accepting the invitation of advertisers to install security equipment in our own homes to make them safer. We may end up using devices to help us watch over our children, so-called nanny cams, so that you can check what the daycare center is doing with the children, what the nanny is doing with the children. You can check just in the corner of your computer screen to check that your children are okay. So we start to think in surveillance terms in everyday life. And of course we use social media for social surveillance. And so many things that we could say about the ways in which ordinary users of social media end up using the same kinds of techniques as the producers of the social media, the Mark Zuckerbergs of this world who invent things like Facebook. We end up using the kinds of techniques that they have developed for commercial purposes, basically. That's what Facebook is for, collecting personal data so that you can be sold more things and encouraged to think of yourself as being this sort of person through who your friends are. We end up adopting those for ourselves and start thinking in terms of those ways of doing social surveillance. Again, we can talk about more of that later. Let me say a couple of things about 21st century surveillance then. So in other words, it's 2015, just in the last 15 years. Two very important things happened in the 21st century. One is the attacks that are known generally as 9/11. I don't think it's the best term, but 9/11 is the way most people know them. That's one crucial development in the 21st century. What 9/11 did, among other things, was to create new departments in many countries around the world, not just in the United States, called Homeland Security or some parallel idea. Whatever the homeland is and whatever security is. You will notice that in most places in the world, neither homeland nor security is ever defined. So that was one thing. Of course, we see it in policing, we see it in intelligence activities, we also see it economically in the ways in which the new media corporations, which were in big trouble in the 1990s, suddenly found a market. In the 1990s, there was a lot of economic distress in the new technology companies. After 9/11, a whole new world of opportunity appeared. That is not a cynical statement. It could be read cynically. It's not a cynical statement. It's one that you can look at the evidence for the huge growth of those corporations after 9/11 in relation to the promises that were made about the new security that could be established using their techniques. So, huge investment for security, surveillance for the state, policing, intelligence, massive reliance on various centers of new surveillance technology industries. And it has to be said that one of the global leaders today is Israel. And there's a huge international reliance on Israeli technologies of surveillance and of surveillance techniques, not just technologies, but techniques such as behavioral observation in the airports. By 2008, the Beijing Olympics was supplied very heavily by Israeli surveillance corporations. There are a number of surveillance corporations around the world that follow major events, Olympics being an obvious one, but also World Cup football, soccer as it's called in Canada and the United States, international meetings, world summits, G8, G20, all these kinds of things, kind of traveling circuses of political dignitaries or sports celebrities. Wherever such major events are occurring, mega events they're sometimes called, there you have security technology and surveillance corporations in very strong evidence. And the Israelis have a corner on that global market. It has become, as Neve Gordon says, a global homeland security capital. So all these things are tremendously important in the post-9/11 era. At the same time, however, 2004 saw the invention of Facebook. It wasn't the only social media enterprise out there, but it rapidly became the biggest name in the field. That is to say, the biggest name in the English-speaking world first, and then as Facebook added many other languages in other places too. Only countries like China and South Korea and one or two others founded their own version of Facebook, and they have quite different kinds of rationales, and they've developed in different ways. But Facebook became hugely important very rapidly. And that cannot be underestimated in its importance right next to the fallout from 9/11. The two things ended up being very closely connected. Who would have connected a means of interaction between peer groups with state surveillance? The connection may not have been obvious, but it soon became profound. So social media, using the same kinds of technologies as those major security and surveillance technology companies, they have developed alongside. So that today, if you're looking for facial recognition technology, which you might imagine is the monopoly of policing or intelligence agencies, it is not. Facebook has a bigger facial recognition industry and superior techniques to any intelligence agency or any policing department in the world. These things have become part and parcel of sort of parallel universes that are actually interacting universes. The devices that we use. One researcher, Rob Kling in Ireland, talks about the devices that we carry, handheld devices. He says these should not be referred to as objects. He says they are logjects. Now this is a play on words in English, and I have no idea whether we could make a similar word in Arabic. But if you get the English, object becomes logject. Object just suggests an inert thing. It just suggests something that is material and doesn't do anything. A logject is something that records its own usage. It logs it. And so the object becomes something that is, as it were, aware of its own use. And that makes the thing far more significant. I sometimes ask my students, why do you carry PTDs with you all the time? A PTD is a personal tracking device. And they look at me and they wonder what I'm asking. And I say, well, this thing that was sold to you as a smartphone is actually a PTD. It's a personal tracking device. Why do you find it necessary to carry a personal tracking device with you everywhere you go? It's a logject. It's recording its own use the whole time. And the recording of its own use is available more to the corporations and the police and to the nation state than it is to you. You don't know what is being recorded of your use of that device, but the organizations that sold it to you or who have the capacity to capture those data, they do know how it is being used and when and with whom and as you move from place to place. It's a logject. It's a PTD. English, sorry. You'll have to work that out for yourself in Arabic. But that's what they are. Okay, I think I should wrap up. Many other things that we could talk about here. The key trends here are towards huge expansion. The kinds of surveillance that I've been talking about is expanding massively. It means that we are increasingly visible to organizations that are less and less visible to us. Did you get that? We are more and more visible to organizations of many kinds, and those organizations are less and less visible to us. Very important to think about that. Increasingly, the surveillance is not just of this happening or this word or this image, but rather it is much more of an integrated thing and one that includes mobile activities. So where you are when, not just who you are, which you might show with an ID card, but where you were when becomes much easier to demonstrate using a logject, using a device, using a smartphone. It's become global. There are many countries in the world where, for example, a telephone service was inadequately there was inadequate architecture for a full telephone service using landlines. Today, in a number of countries, new developments have enabled a leapfrogging so that you move straight to cell phones and smartphones. So the infrastructure becomes far more easily available than in countries where originally a landline had to be developed. Increasingly, too, it's data from our own bodies that are crucial for surveillance. I already mentioned facial recognition, but from old-fashioned fingerprinting through to iris scans and many other ways in which the body becomes the way in which we are made visible rather than just something that we said or did. There's increasing confusion about what is personal data. I started by saying, well, surveillance has to do with the close attention to personal information. But what is personal information? The metadata that is collected on us all the time doesn't have anything to do directly with who I am. It has to do with who I contacted when, or how long my call was, or whatever. And so, is that personal information? Well, it sure tells us a lot about who I am, even though you wouldn't necessarily think that that was personal information. Or the license plate on your car. Or a picture of you on Facebook that was taken by someone else and just happened to be in a group scene. Is that personal data? Well, it's very easy to use it as personal data. So, in many ways, the very idea of what personal data is more difficult to define. Okay, I'm closing. Nothing that I have said is inevitable. Nothing that I've said is irreversible. Nothing that I've said is a situation that we can do nothing about and nothing to correct, nothing to change. I don't believe that, and I don't believe that that approach is helpful at all. If the kind of talk that I've just given inspires paranoia, that's precisely not the sort of approach that I think is an appropriate one to thinking about this. We've got some analytic tools now for saying what it is that's going on. We can see what it is more clearly, and that gives us more chance to be able to assess it ethically, to contest it politically, and to argue about it with each other about what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. And so you should not take me to be saying that somehow there is this surveillance machine that is taking over our lives and there's nothing we can do. Nothing could be further from what I believe. It is possible to make a difference in this world of contemporary surveillance. It requires action on many levels: technical, educational, political, in so many different ways. Legal areas, policy areas, all are possible for making a difference. Surveillance politics is certainly crucial for today's world, but it also requires that practical ethical distance from those other ways, which can also be other-ing ways, the ways that we may be treated as the other, from those surveillance systems that do indeed help to determine how we conceive society, how we describe our neighbor, how we see ourselves, and who we believe we are. We don't have to go with this system, these systems. There are many ways of responding that are appropriate, I believe, ethically and politically. And in the next 2.5 weeks, we're going to be talking about a lot of them together. And I look forward to spending more time with you discussing surveillance. Thank you very much.
بروفيسور ليون، حقيقة هذا كان متوقع، ولكن أنا شخصيا فاق بعض توقعاتي، لأنه أنا بعد ما أخلص هالمحاضرة راح أرمي الموبايلين هدول في سلة الزبالة وأنا طالع، وعليكم كلكم ترموهم. أنا على كل أحوال واحد من التكنيكس اللي أنا بستخدمه بروفيسور إني بحمل موبايلين وبخلي موبايل في البيت، بخلي ابني يستخدمه، فبحاول أموه بالضبط وين أنا موجود. بس شكله بعد محاضرتك حتى التكنيك هاي مش راح ينفع، فعلى الأغلب لازم نتخلص منهن. على كل أحوال يعني بتوقع انه انتم في هالمحاضرة كثير فكرتوا في بعض الاشياء اللي تعرضتوا لها وطبقتوها على حياتنا. منشان هيك احنا بدينا نقول هاي محاضرة جدا بتخصنا نحن اولا كفلسطينيين وبشكل عام. واسرائيل حقيقة تستخدم هذا الموضوع باشكال سياسية وقانونية وامنية متواصلة. يعني لما حكى عن التصنيفات الكاتيجوريز، يعني اسرائيل ضالعة في تصنيفنا جغرافيا. يعني غزة إلها هوية، إلها لون، على فكرة بتعرفوا القدس إلها لون، الضفة إلها لون. هلا اخترعوا شيء جديد اسمه الزيم زون، هذه المنطقة اللي ما بين الجدار وما بين منطقة سي. هاي التصنيفات كلها إلها أبعاد سياسية وأيديولوجية وما شابه. يعني مقسميننا عمريا وفي حسب المراحل، مين أقل من 40 مسموح له وين ومين أكثر من 40. مقسميننا اجتماعيا، مين متزوج ومين عنده أطفال. كل هاي ريليتس لنا، يعني له علاقة بقضيتنا. وأنا في تقديري اليوم وضح البروفيسور ليون انه موضوعة الرصد هي مش بس موضوع امنية، مش فقط القضية امنية، لها ابعاد كثيرة. وانا اتمنى تكون هاي بداية لنا كباحثين ومختصين واكاديميين ان نهتم نحن فلسطينيين، وحقيقة نحن مش مهتمين بهذا الجانب بالطريقة اللي احنا لابد ان نهتم بها. انا بشكرك جزيلا بروفيسور حقيقة على هذه المعلومات، على هذه المحاضرة القيمة، وبفتح باب النقاش. تفضلوا. تفضل أخي.
Good evening, Professor Leon. I have a question of two aspects. First of all, you said we can't judge an act of surveillance, whether it was right or wrong. But later on you said that it's not neutral. So based on that, and knowing that we cannot keep judging any act based on the result, we need to know what to do before we know the resulting act, what comes up next. So what I mean is, if I want to say that surveillance is right or wrong, I cannot say that it's right in this case and it's wrong in that case. And judging that it's something that exists now, we can't argue on its existence. So, and we cannot say that we should allow surveillance in certain cases because we can exploit those acts of surveillance in other ways. So what I want to say that what should we do in terms of judging surveillance before we conclude to anything, so that we can have a, let's say, safer society and not open the door for governments and other actors to control citizens' lives?
Okay, good question.
You need Arabic translation for the question?
The question was in very good English. What I said about the assessment of surveillance is that surveillance is always ambiguous and never neutral. So, in other words, I don't want to give the impression that somehow surveillance is inevitably a socially or politically negative activity. But nor do I want to give the impression that it could ever be thought of as some kind of neutral activity. In other words, it is always ethically assessable and always politically contestable. So, that was my starting point, in fact. And as for the criteria, I don't think there is a set of criteria that we can apply to all forms of surveillance at all times. But there are some very important principles that we can bear in mind when we're thinking about forms of surveillance. So, and those principles really are ethical ones, and they have to do with becoming human. They have to do with human flourishing. They have to do with the common good. So, and I suppose I have to explain one other thing too. It's frequently the case that in discussions of surveillance, questions are raised about privacy. Privacy as a concept developed in the 20th century as a liberal individualist concept over against certain kinds of, especially state incursions into the private lives of citizens, or violations of what you might call a sense of privacy. And because of those things, and because I was writing about and researching about surveillance as social sorting, as part of a social ordering process, as part of a means of classifying groups so that some would be treated differently from others, which frequently has to be understood as the others being a negative treatment, I couldn't connect privacy with surveillance because they didn't seem to be connecting with each other. One had to do with abstract legal features, had to do with the individual as an atom, and not to do with the common good or with the human flourishing of the real person, not just the abstract image. Over the last 20-something years, I have become much more open to using the term privacy and to defending it. So my position has actually changed over the years, and in fact in the book that I've been working on most recently on surveillance after Snowden, I acknowledge in print that my views have changed, and I'm no longer simply attacking privacy as an inadequate concept. And this is for two reasons. One, I now would support the idea of privacy because there is a need in opposition to excessive, inappropriate, or illegal surveillance for some unifying concepts which hold together the movements of those who are opposed to such inappropriate, illegal, and excessive surveillance. And privacy has become one such mobilizing concept in the political arena, and so I support it for that reason. But more importantly, many have been using privacy in ways that are quite different from the original abstract legal liberal notion of privacy, and are now infusing it with content that is much more to do with human relationships, social relationships. Personally, I take the view that humans are never individual atoms, that we are defined by our relationality. We are defined as human beings by our relationship with others. Read my colleague Zygmunt Bauman's work on this sort of thing. He's very strong on the idea of human relationality as being the key characteristic of being or becoming human. And because more and more people are using the term privacy in a way that includes human rights. So human rights, civil liberties, and relationality have become crucial to the definition of privacy in many cases. So I would now use the term privacy, defined thus, and also as part of a mobilizing slogan for connecting different oppositional groups who may be attempting to contest forms of surveillance that are, as I say, inappropriate, excessive, or illegal. So there's, where I'm coming from in terms of privacy, but it also tells you where I'm coming from ethically. Relational, human flourishing, and the development of human rights. I take human rights to be the product of the dignity that every human being has by virtue of being human. Rights that are accorded to that person and to all such persons have to do with the dignity of the person and can never ever be reduced to matters of ethnicity or citizenship or religion or racialized understandings or any other category. It has to do simply with being human. So I take it that it's a kind of fundamental ethical position for making a critique of inappropriate surveillance. So that's where I'd start. And then there are many, many ways of elaborating on that. For example, I think that the fair information principles that have been developed over the last 30 years and are used in many countries in the world are a really good place to start. If there was, by surveillance agencies, a recognition and an acknowledgement of the importance of fair information principles, the world would be a very different place.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor. We'll have Dr. Asim, and I think we'll have one last question after that.
ألو. يعني كنت اليوم اتعلمت أشياء كثيرة منها إنه عملية الرصد ليست إيجابية أو سلبية بحد ذاتها، ولكنها في كل الأحوال غير حيادية. بس هيك كمان كانوا يحكوا على عملية الرصد اللي كانت تصير للصفات الجسمية، أسود أبيض، رجل امرأة، متحضر غير متحضر، سابقا في العصور الاستعمارية، واستخدمت عمليا لتمييز الأشخاص وتصنيفهم بطريقة للهيمنة والسيطرة. فصحيح هذا معناه انه هي غير حيادية، لكني هذا بفسر برضو ليش بنظر لعملية الرصد على انها سلبية. ونقطة تانية وانت ذكرتها، انه عملية تجميع المعلومات هو يخدم وضروري، هي شيء تاني تعلمته، للمانجمنت، للإدارة، لإدارة الدولة، لتحديد سياسات معينة، تشجيع على شراء أو ما إلى ذلك. بس معناه أيضا إنه المعلومات اللي بتتجمع أنا لا أسيطر عليها. وأنت ذكرت إنه حتى بصير أنا أتأثر فيها لاحقا، وكأنها بتشارك عمليا بعكس الصفات الخارجية سابقا. هلا صرنا الداخل الإنسان وأنا مش مسيطر عليه، وبالعكس بتأثر فيه. بعطي مثال، بعرفش إذا مرتبط ولا لا، بس كثير دايما كان يزعجني ويزعج الكثيرين إنه إحنا مثلا ما بنعرف شو إسرائيل بتعتبرنا. لما بنروح على المعابر هناك إحنا دايما نتوقع في أي لحظة إنه إحنا مصنفين من اليوم وطالع إننا مطلوبين، أو مصنفين إنه ممنوعين من السفر. هاي عدم الثقة أو عدم معرفة إنه شو الطرف الآخر بيوصفني، شو صفاتي. وروح على برافو على محل سوبر ماركت بدك تشتري، بيسألوك عن معلومات وباخدوا الكود وباخدوا دايما الرقم. ما بتعرف الطرف الآخر شو بيصنفنا يعني. وبالآخر هذا مزعج بقدر إزعاج اللي كان يصير لتوصيف الأشخاص إنهم أسمر أو أبيض أو امرأة أو رجل، وخلق يعني ثقافات بهذا الاتجاه. فيعني أنا بس بدي أحاول أقول إنه صحيح أنا اللي سمعته جديد، ولكني لساتني متوتر من فكرة إنه أستعمل الرصد على إنه شيء قد يكون له إيجابيات. وأرجو إنك توضح لي ما هي إيجابيات عملية الرصد، غير إنها عمليا بتساعد بإعادة تعريف الإنسان لنفسه. وآخر نقطة بجوز حتى من الباك جراوند القانوني، إنه التحديدات اللي أو مدى اهتمام المشرعين والدساتير بموضوع التطورات التكنولوجية لضمان عدم انجرار التكنولوجيا الحديثة باتجاه استخدام غير المشروع للمعلومات. كثير أنا انزعجت من فكرة إنه، وهي صحيحة كنت أعرفها ولكن ذكرتها، إنه إحنا ما بنعرف يعني استعملت الكلمة الجميلة هاي لوج تكس، يعني إحنا عمليا في رصد لكل حركاتنا وقدرة على استخدامها من آخرين، وإحنا مش بالضرورة واعيين لها. فهذا كثير مزعج يعني. وأنا بس بحكي إنه مزعج، بظن حتى أسمع منك شو في إيجابيات لعملية الرصد بالطرق الحديثة.
Great, yeah, thank you. This is a really good.
By the way, he's not tracked whatsoever. You can never reach him by phone. He doesn't answer. I don't think it's a matter for him anyway.
Okay, so in 3 weeks I should have some opportunity to understand some of these nuances. Yeah, I totally sympathize with the question. I can feel it in what you're saying, because I too have I have exactly the same questioning. And I think the description that I was trying to give of the ways in which the surveillance technologies over the past 100 years have developed is one that is mainly, I think, in a negative direction. Mainly. So that, for example, the results of what I was saying about the possibilities for remote and abstract forms of surveillance are increasing constantly. And those are generally very negative indeed. So I don't disagree with you at all. Historically, I think we can consider certain kinds of surveillance as being, if you like, prudent. Realism about the likely antagonisms or the likelihood for negative behaviors occurring in society. I think there are some ways in which, if you like, what you might call pre-modern surveillance may be justifiable. That's the sort of thing that I'm thinking. That a community that has in the past experienced negative treatment from others outside their community may want to introduce some means of making visible that which is not easily visible for the sake of protecting a given population. So those are the sorts of things that I have in mind. And I would still like to think that it is possible to engage in such surveillance, building on what I would think of as a pre-modern or even antique, ancient kind of surveillance that does not fall foul of the negative arguments that I was making against many forms of surveillance, especially the remote, abstract, and so on. But to turn that around and to ask how one might make certain kinds of surveillance that are already occurring more acceptable or less negative anyway, I would say that the keys to that process are twofold. One is called accountability, and the other is called transparency. And here I'm thinking of the ways in which the surveillance agency, I believe, has a responsibility to those who are surveilled to be transparent about what their activities are. That is to say, to allow those who are experiencing the surveillance to know the circumstances under which they will be surveilled, the criteria by which they are surveilled, and the consequences of that surveillance. If those things were clear, the world would be a much better place. And so that's the transparency. The accountability is the accountability of those agencies to those who are being surveilled. That those who are being surveilled, and I think of it as a democratic process, in other words, a form of accountability which is expected within the surveiller-surveillee relationship. And this is what is massively missing in contemporary forms, especially of state security kinds of surveillance. This is exactly what's missing. Yesterday, I did not know why it took 3.5 hours to get it. You don't know what they know. They don't know you don't know how they're going to use it. You don't know the consequences of the use of that information. Now that's what I think of as the untransparent, the opaque surveillance that I think is entirely unjustified and unnecessary. But I think if the twofold criteria of transparency and accountability were applied to these organizations, we would see some very, very different things happening in the contemporary world. It's very difficult to see how the world that we have now made could go into reverse. I said earlier that nothing that I've said is irreversible. I still think that. But I think it's very hard at the same time to see how the global economic machine, global system of nation states, global system of telecommunications and digital communications could somehow be turned around overnight. Therefore, I think that a good pragmatic principle is half a loaf is better than no bread. If you can make a change that is going to reduce the negative impact of that surveillance by many, many times, then those changes I see would be to do with holding for privacy, as I said in the first answer, that means civil liberties, human rights, human flourishing, etc. And on the other hand, if the organizations that engage in surveillance were accountable and transparent in their activities. And, one can give examples of how organizations have indeed been reined in, have had their activities reduced. One can talk about that. And there are principles like so-called data minimization. We don't have to collect all those data. If you listen to what the American National Security Agency says, they say, collect it all. A, there is no proof that collecting it all makes a blind bit of difference. But B, by data minimization, you can actually reduce the number of fields or reduce the amount of information that's required in ways that would actually increase the efficacy of the system to actually do what it's intended to do in the first place. I think there are huge problems with that kind of collect it all, which is basically showing a belief in what new technology can do that is not warranted even by the results that it gives. So we can talk about this later, but I think I really sympathize with your question. I know exactly what you're saying. And a lot of what I'm arguing really is that the situation at present is getting worse and worse in terms of surveillance and in terms of an ethical assessment of it. And moreover, there is not enough political contestation of it either. We haven't tried it enough, but it's coming. There are groups that are emerging that I think stand much more chance of making a difference in this field. So, I'm not optimistic, but I'm not unhopeful either. And I think there is a lot more to be said for hope than for optimism. But that's another story too.
طيب لأنه تداركنا الوقت لو ما فيش سؤال نهائي أنا تركت المعلومات الأخيرة لآخر المحاضرة ألا وهي اللي عنده نية يتوسع أكثر في هالمجال. بدي أعدلكم بسرعة 4 كتب آخر 4 كتب نشرها البروفيسور. الأولى يعني الأحدث هو باسم Transparent Lives Surveillance in Canada انتشر 2014. الثاني هو Liquid Surveillance انتشر ب 2012. الثالث هو Identifying Citizens ID Cards as Surveillance ب 2009. والرابع هو Surveillance Studies an Overview انتشر ب 2007. كمان له أكثر من كتاب فيها المواضيع منهم Eyes Everywhere The Global Growth of Camera Surveillance. وبالتالي في حقل المعلومات الموجودة هناك كتب منشورة من البروفيسور ممكن تطلعوا عليها. أنا أولا للمرة الثانية بدي أشكر البروفيسور على هذه المحاضرة القيمة جدا جدا جدا. وأنا شخصيا حقيقة سعيد جدا وفخور جدا أنها كانت أول محاضرة لمعهد بيرزيت للإدارة الحكومية. هاي بكورة وفاتحة جيدة وبتحطنا على مستوى كنا نصبو له من النقاش والمعلومات الحقيقية التي تخص الشأن العام. أخيرا بقدر ما الرصد هو بالمحصلة شيء سلبي التكنولوجيا هي حد من سيفين يا بروفيسور. أنا هون بدي أنهي زي ما السمارت فونز والفيسبوك هو أداة تشكل أداة حقيقية في الدول والحكومات من أجل الرصد للأشخاص والسيطرة والتحكم في الأشخاص. أيضا هذه التكنولوجيا قد تكون أداة للأشخاص من أجل التواصل والتنظيم والمقاومة. وهذا ما حصل في الربيع العربي على سبيل المثال. الفيسبوك لعب دور أساسي وفي تقديري أن هذه التكنولوجيا التي نتحدث عنها مثل الفيسبوك ووسائل التواصل الاجتماعي سيكون لها دور أساسي في صراعنا هنا على الأرض خصوصا في فلسطين. هذه المعلومات وبالتالي محاضرتك قيمة ويجب نحن كفلسطينيين أن نستكمل هذا البحث وهذا النقاش. شكرا جزيلا لكم جميعا وإلى
our bearings with each other. It might be better if we start with your questions from the talk and then we can launch into other areas. But there was a reading that I suggested for just now for this session. And there is also a reading that connects to to what I was saying about the trends. And you may well be interested in looking at looking at those two readings, because they will give you quite a lot of background. So the one that connected with the lecture or really expanded on some of the ideas from the lecture is in the book that was just mentioned, which is Transparent Lives, Surveillance in Canada. Now, it's a bit of a trick title, because although it's about surveillance in Canada, in fact, it's about surveillance anywhere, but the examples in the book are from Canada. So it's not really only about Canada. All of the trends that we look at in that book, I made the book with a number of colleagues, a research team. All of the trends that we look at there are visible in other countries around the world, including right here in Palestine. So it's just that the examples you will find there are Canadian ones. So if you would like, you have my full permission to write your own little piece about surveillance in Palestine and use our trends and say, this is how the trends look in Palestine. So we really, in my research group, we really wanted people to be able to use the trends wherever. So if you have a little group of you that wants to write something about surveillance in Palestine, you're welcome to use our ideas and give Palestinian examples. Okay, so there's a little research project for you. Right off the top, you can find your own examples, and we would be more than happy to know that the book is being used in other contexts and other examples are being put in there. And there are other, although the book hasn't been published for very long, we know that there are other countries that are planning to use the book to put their own examples in anyway. So it's up to you if you want to try and do that. So those trends, when I was talking about the ways in which I'm getting... Oh, okay. Okay, fine. Sorry, I'm having a little discussion with my friend. So, I need to switch that thing off. So, that's what we can say about the trends. And that particular reading you can find online. You look under surveillanceincanada.org. So surveillanceincanada.org will get you to that publication. And if, for example, you have French rather than English as a second language, then le livre est disponible aussi en français. Yeah, they're both there. The English and French versions are both available online. And yeah, it's called Open Access Publishing. It hasn't appeared very much in the university world yet, but we have one publisher in Canada that makes open access possible. So you can either buy the book as a regular book, or you can see the thing online. Okay, so, and the other reading I think was from the Surveillance Studies book. So maybe I should just say something about that. The Surveillance Studies book is available in your package, and it's not for wide distribution, it's just for this class that we made the electronic version available. And that book I wrote in response to my publisher, who wanted to have a general introduction to surveillance issues. And I try in that book to really cover a range of areas that come under the surveillance rubric. And so the reading, actually I think we made all the chapters available, but the chapter that I gave that relates to today was intended to give you some kind of basic grounding. Now, I come from a history and sociology background, rather than political science or policy studies or law, but some of what I say, I think, is very much within the disciplinary boundaries of those disciplines as well. So I hope you'll find it accessible and helpful. Anyway, why don't you tell me what your questions are from the talk that we just had, and from that I'll also be trying to get a sense of where you're coming from and what sorts of questions you want to address, because then as we go along through subsequent days, we can try to make what we talk about more relevant to your situation. It's not that I don't think that it's helpful for you to have a broader sense of the ways in which surveillance occurs around the world. I think it is important for you to have that. But at the same time, I'm very aware that you want to have a real strong sense of how surveillance is operating here in Palestine. And while I can't give you much from personal experience, I can at least point you in the direction of the kinds of resources and the kinds of concepts that might help you to get a better sense of what is going on in the world of surveillance today. So, I'd like to hear what your questions are from the talk that I gave. And anyone can ask a question, and I'm very happy to hear what it is that you have to say. Yeah.
Hello. I don't know if it's a straightforward question, but the way I heard about surveillance as a culture and then almost as a means of control, if that's correct, it kind of sounds to me something like sci-fi, almost as we're going to a sci-fi realm where our social or our human behavior is going to be predictable at one point, and everything that we're ought to do is already known. So, and what I see in that is almost as if I was watching a movie. Our health issues are less of a problem, low crime rates, and like there's more control of our human instincts, maybe. And I feel like, is that the battle we're in right now? Mm-hmm. Is that a battle that we're going through as humans? Are we going through the battle of controlling our instincts, our human instincts, or are we trying to go back to fight for our free will? Or are people so oblivion to it that they don't even know the difference of what's going on nowadays? And this is why we're actually having this lecture here.
Mm-hmm. Well, you worried that it isn't a good question or something. I think it's a great question. It also takes us into the realm of imaginative products like novels or films, because you said it sounds like some kind of sci-fi film where the future is known in advance, or our thoughts or intentions are known in advance. And sure, I think that's a very, very good question. And you also brought in the point about control and the ways in which, how without knowing it, we are, as it were, controlled. So, yeah, I already mentioned George Orwell's book, 1984. Just out of interest, who has read 1984? Have you actually read the thing? Okay, so it's more of a phrase or a cliche we know about Big Brother and not much else. Okay. At the same time, or a little earlier than George Orwell was writing, there was another British writer called Aldous Huxley. And he wrote a book called Brave New World. And again, you've probably heard the name Brave New World and maybe not actually read the novel. And it's interesting that they would both write about these kinds of themes because both were dystopias. Okay, so utopia is a sort of ideal world projected, and a dystopia is the opposite. It's a worst case scenario worked out, in this case, in a novel. So Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, had to do with what he called conditioning. So this is a bit like, psychological experiments, Pavlov's dogs and all that sort of thing, where people are conditioned to respond in particular ways. And for Huxley, the surveillance future was not of Big Brother and the state bearing down on citizens. It was more to do with, there was actually a drug involved called Soma. And it was through the enjoyment of the consumption of the drug that the Brave New World came into being. You didn't need Big Brother because people bought the right stuff and everyone would be happy. But it was a dystopia because you also discover what happens in that kind of a world. But nonetheless, there's that kind of contrast between the control by Big Brother and, on the other hand, no need for control because people are consuming the right thing. And you can easily read into that sort of consumer capitalism in the 21st century and so on. So that's a couple of novels. If you're really looking for a novel about contemporary surveillance, however, I would go not to either of those, but to one by an American novelist called Dave Eggers, called The Circle. And that is a brilliant contemporary novel about a Silicon Valley corporation called The Circle, and about a young woman of 24 who goes to work there, and the life that they lead in the corporation, and then eventually in all of their lives, is totally transparent to the organization 24/7. There is never any break in that total transparency to the corporation. Anyway, that's a very cool novel produced a couple of years ago called The Circle. And I have no idea if there's an Arabic translation, but, you can find the thing in various English forms. As for movies, what you said reminded me of Minority Report. I don't know if you know the Spielberg novel from 2002, but that is very much along the lines of knowing in advance what is being thought and what is being intended. And in that case, there is a police department in the year 2054 that is using these techniques in order to tell where a murder is going to take place in advance of the murder. Now, they do use Philip K. Dick's precogs, which were these curious female figures that are kind of floating in some kind of liquid. It's kind of bizarre. However, you don't need that. If you have contemporary digital technologies, then you don't need the precogs because the algorithms of contemporary digital technologies dispense with any need for precogs. But in terms of a movie that shows the sort of thing that I think you were referring to, then that Minority Report movie is a really interesting one, and it's doubly interesting because it came out in 2002, just when the Department of Homeland Security in the United States was coming into being. And the description of the methods in Minority Report very accurately reflect what was going on in the new American Department of Homeland Security at exactly that time. Spielberg did a lot of research for making that film with Silicon Valley companies in order to find out what they thought was the next thing that was going to be developed in intelligence gathering. And so he got a kind of Silicon Valley view before what became the Department of Homeland Security went to the same companies to find out what was the next best thing. So there's a curious symmetry between Minority Report 2002 and Department of Homeland Security 2002. Anyway, that's a sort of long, rambly answer to your question about the prediction in advance. But let me say this. The forms of control that I would be referring to are the kinds of control that the social political theorist Gilles Deleuze talks about. So this is not Michel Foucault, but Michel Foucault's associate and then critic, in which Deleuze talked about control as a way of, as it were, switching on and switching off taps to control the flow. So it's control in the sense of gaining or being denied admittance or access. And that can be physical, getting across a border, or it can be online, access denied. Or it has to do with eligibility. So you're either eligible for some benefit or reward or activity or practice, or your eligibility has been blocked or again denied. So it's that kind of control. It's the control of that which is flowing. Again, it's a liquid metaphor. So Deleuze is not talking so much as Foucault was about the kind of discipline that surveillance would have on the individual. You know there's a camera up here, so you start behaving in a particular way because the camera is watching you. So there's the kind of panoptic effect of surveillance in a disciplinary context. Deleuze talks about control, and that's the kind of control he has in mind. And so I think you can see the connection between what I was saying about control and the ways in which we might start to accept for ourselves the forms of control that are in a sense over against us. And it's very subtle, and it happens in different contexts in different ways. But for me, the important thing is to say state surveillance is really very important, but we've gone beyond the Orwell stage of state surveillance existing, as it were, on its own, to surveillance society, where surveillance occurs in all kinds of everyday contexts. It is in the camera surveillance. On stoplights in the street, the camera that's up there to check. Cameras that are used for all kinds of purposes, for maintaining traffic flow, catching people who run red lights, all that kind of thing. It's right there, but it's also visible in many other kinds of contexts as well. I lost the train of my thought where I was going. Happens to the best of us, and when you start being a senior, then it doesn't matter anymore if you forget your train of thought, because hey, every moment is a senior moment, and I don't have to apologize. But I have forgotten what I was going to say. Where were we? We were talking about control and the acceptance. Yeah, exactly. So Yeah, so there's that surveillance society, if you like. Surveillance is in all kinds of places. But what I wanted to say beyond that, surveillance state, surveillance society, what I was trying to say beyond that is I believe that there are some very important signs of what I now call surveillance culture. And when I say surveillance culture, I mean it is not just that surveillance is out there, it's in here. We have allowed surveillance to become part of our own self-definition. We've allowed it to become part of our everyday practices. We check up on others who are not known to us using social media in ways that might embarrass or distress the others. And when we start to do that, then we're looking very like the surveillance agencies whose presence we deplore because they also don't have that transparency and that accountability to us. So I say that there is a growing surveillance culture in which we not only accept surveillance, but we start to do surveillance and we start to act in surveillant ways that are dependent on high technology. We're still using high technology as well. It's not like surveillance, peeping behind a curtain anymore. It's not surveillance where we steal a glance. It's surveillance where we're actually using high-tech equipment, just like large-scale surveillance agencies. So I think there is an important shift that is taking place culturally, and I call it surveillance culture. So that is a very long answer to your question, but that's where we were. Yeah, you had one. I think they want the mic to be used so that we have a full recording, full surveillance.
Okay. Well, I just something crossed my mind just now while we were talking to the brother concerning do we really choose to accept? To participate in using. How to be anticipating the society. How to look at the society and how we look to others surrounding us. Did we really have to choose that, or the context led us to maybe finally be part of this circle?
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe it, actually.
Yeah, great question. I think what is happening is that in many ways we are kind of seduced into such surveillance culture. We're drawn into it because it has to do with our consumer behavior. It has to do with our everyday routines of how we contact other people, how we consume, and so on. And so it's very easy to be seduced into it. But you said, do we choose? And I would say that there is a lot of non-choosing, that we do it, as it were, without thinking. But the fuller answer, I think, is we do not have to choose to do it. Once we become aware of what we're doing, I think it's perfectly possible to say no and not to do those very things that turn us into a product of surveillance culture. So I think it's a prime opportunity for us to act resistantly, even in kind of everyday contexts of surveillance culture. And indeed, if in our everyday use of Facebook and Twitter and other social media, we start to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate behavior, that's also an opportunity for learning surveillance critique and surveillance and to contest surveillance in a bigger, wider context than just our own kind of personal consumer behavior or our own personal communication with other people. So yeah, I think sometimes we do just kind of enter that activity without thinking. I mean, who would think in kind of an everyday way, oh my gosh, I am being a surveillor, or I am engaging in surveillance? You wouldn't. But now that you've heard the way that I put it together, you can probably hear ways in which, yeah, maybe I have participated in surveillance culture, and I don't want to do it anymore because I can see the negative dimensions of it. And I think there are ways of turning that, those developments in interpersonal activity and online behavior and the use of smartphones and so on into a very different way of acting, which I think has wider implications for the politics of surveillance more generally. Great questions. Other questions or comments? I'd be particularly interested if you didn't understand something I was saying, or if you objected to what I was saying and you have a different view. Anyway, yours. It's there. It's coming.
بدي أحكي عن الوسائل الجديدة، الطرق اللي استخدمتها إسرائيل لمراقبة بدي أحكي عن الطرق الجديدة اللي استخدمتها إسرائيل لمراقبة الفلسطينيين، خاصة اللي بيعيشوا داخل الخط الأخضر، اللي هم بيحملوا بطاقة لونها أزرق للقدس. استبدلوها ببطاقة مغناطة بتحدد موقع الأشخاص، يعني بيكون تحمل زي شريحة بتحدد موقع الشخص بالضبط. وهي من أسوأ المراقبة ممكن يتعرض إليها الفلسطينيين حتى بحياتهم الخاصة، يعني تجاوزت وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي والفيسبوك والبليفون. إيش مدى خطورتها هاي على الفلسطينيين والمراقبة؟
Yeah, another really good question. Of course, the idea of identification, holding identification or showing ID is one that dates back a long time in this part of the world as in others. And identification systems were set up both under the British during the British Mandate period, and these were enhanced during the 1930s, and also, of course, once the development of the new IDs under the State of Israel were developed after 1948. I've tried to explore a little bit of that. That's the only area that I've kind of worked in where there is some research of mine that relates to your question, and that is in one of the readings. I don't know if you saw that already, but it's in one of the readings in the book called Surveillance and Control in Israel-Palestine. And there's a chapter. Actually, there are two chapters in that book. Helga Towel-Sauri has another chapter, and her chapter kind of is complementary to the chapter that I made. Yes, I agree that is that the use of both any kind of additional location technology to what already is something that can be used anywhere is an important addition from the point of view of surveillance power over individuals, and in this case, talking about Palestinians. There's already a sense in which I wrote somewhere else about surveillance IDs being everywhere. So in the sense that the border is no longer the thing that, as it were, holds people in. That kind of mythical line where people are held in. An ID card enables the border to be everywhere, because you don't have to be crossing a line in order to be under surveillance. You are aware of that line because of the ID card wherever you are, even if it is one that has no electronic components in it at all. So it's already moving in that direction when you set up different forms of ID for different groups in the population. Remember what I said about social sorting and the ways in which the different population categories are developed in order so that they can be treated differently. It's exactly what is happening with ID cards. But then to add another dimension, which is the electronic traceability of that card and therefore the location monitoring of populations, it simply increases the surveillance capacity in ways that in ways that are what we call exponential. I mean, it rises in a steeper graph the more you have locatability built into the card itself. So it increases the effectiveness of the surveillance and increases the vulnerability of the person who is under surveillance. So yeah, it's crucial for maintaining the kinds of power relations that are evident in Israel-Palestine. And of course, within each, in each geographical territory, within each, those different classifications lead to different outcomes. So yeah, it is tremendously important, and perhaps, you know, in my talk earlier, I wasn't emphasizing that enough because, as I said, the context that I came from was trying to finish up my book on surveillance after Snowden, in which identifiability of individuals comes primarily in the United States and Canada from being online and from using smartphones. That's where the mobile identifiability of individuals and populations is made evident. We have some forms of identification documents in Canada and the United States, but nothing that you have to carry all the time, nothing that has internal locatability built in. So yeah, probably the situation that I come from and live in all the time was making me lean towards the discussion of identifiability online and using smartphones. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That is a critical moment of nation-state policing and intelligence gathering using those kinds of IDs. And do you want to just say it again into the microphone, and then it'll be recorded for everyone.
No problem. With the surveillance, we are losing our humanity because we maybe in the 18th and 19th we have our homes. They can't. We have free places like homes. No one can control us. But recently with the smartphones and the other technology like satellites, if you go to the desert or in the ocean, you are under control and they can use the data. Even with the smart card, how they can locate your place, it's something dangerous. We are living in a new world. We are going toward a big prison that there is some people who are controlling all the world, all the society. They can use what product you should use. They can control your mind, and that's what's happening with the new media, social media, and what we are watching on the TVs about Daesh and Islamic or any terrorist groups in the world. We are living in a surveillance world. How they come? Or so we can imagine, or we can think, and we can say in this fact that they create these people for something, because the world is under control from the advance or any other organization since 10 years at least, with the high technology and these things. And the point I want to raise in these 2 weeks about the colonial surveillance, how the Palestinian and our living in under control by Israeli and surveilled every day, every simple action we are doing in our homes and our lives, how we can do something like a revolution.
Or to be able, in one sentence, to give some ideas about how to mount resistance to it. But it certainly is the case, and all the reading that I have done and the times that I have spent interacting with my Palestinian colleagues and friends has certainly underlined exactly what you're saying, that there are various ways of experiencing surveillance that are more and less intense and more and less oppressive, and more and less capable of being transcended or opposed. And I certainly think it's the case that here in the occupied territories, there is a far stronger, viscerally felt sense that you just described very well about being a prisoner or being incarcerated in a situation, and I can appreciate that, and I understand it from what my various colleagues have shared with me who've understood it directly as well. I have to emphasize, of course, that there are many places in the world where that intensity of experience of surveillance is not shared. There are many places where you do not have to live your life in fear or uncertainty about who knows what about you, or who knows where you are, or who knows what you're doing, and that sort of thing. There are many places where the intensity of surveillance is far less. The weight of surveillance is much lighter. The sense of the oppressiveness of that situation is not nearly so intense. So it does vary around the world. I happen to think that what we have been discovering over the last nearly 2 years since Edward Snowden started leaking information about the National Security Agency in the United States, I think we have learned that the dangers of surveillance in many other countries are far greater than many people thought, and that the risks, the vulnerability to individuals is far greater than we previously imagined. So, but that is not something that is really properly understood yet. Unfortunately, in many other countries in the world, there is an association of national security with personal safety. And many people believe that if national security is better organized, they will be personally safer. It does not work that way. To have national security is to protect all sorts of things like what they call critical infrastructure, or transit hubs like airports and train stations and so on. It doesn't necessarily make anyone any safer. And there's plenty of evidence to show that. So the connection between national security and personal safety is not a direct one at all. And this is one of the things that has to be worked out in many countries around the world. But here, yes, I think the situation is one of intensive surveillance, of very secretive surveillance, and therefore unaccountable and untransparent surveillance. And I think, in the discussions that we have together, it would be quite interesting to try to talk through what some possibilities might be for questioning or finding modes of resistance that do make sense. Some of them may include the reduction of our use of personal devices, because they are very significant. You can't do much about an ID card except change the system. You can do something about the ways that you use your personal device. But there are also ways, I think, of using the already existing legislation and policies to say, well, this legislation or this policy is not being followed. So I think, for example, of, I think it was in 2013, the meeting of privacy commissioners and data protection officials from around the world was held here in, not here at all, it was held in Israel. And so these people were coming together to talk in Israel about the importance of what I described as fair information practices. And I think that it's possible to use those kinds of legal tools as a means of drawing attention to ways in which surveillance is inappropriately carried out. And so I think you can use, in a kind of judo strategy, if you know what I mean, use the strength of the opposition in order to overcome. So I think there are ways of using already existing legal and policy and regulative kinds of measures to advantage the people who are being disadvantaged by such systems. So I think there are various strategies that can be used, and there's just a couple of them. But I think this is one area that we could well discuss over the next 3 weeks while I'm here. And I look forward to learning more from you in questions like this, so thank you for that. Other questions? I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but still we've got a couple of minutes, I think. Yeah, well, just a minute. Let's just see if there's somebody else with a question first. There are more women than men here, so really more women than men should ask questions. So let's get the gender balance right, eh? Okay, but failing further questions from women, questions from guys, even guys who've asked a question previously are welcome. Go for it.
I was gonna say that let's say for Palestine, we're not facing a bigger, like the same issue as a modern state is facing. You know, our problems are, we're not that connected to the internet. I don't think we are. Like, we barely have 3G around here. Wi-Fi is not that accessible. We're in a university, we don't have Wi-Fi. But I do think that we should raise awareness about, especially in our case, as Palestinians, and under occupation, under severe surveillance from sky and from everywhere, our phones, everything. I think it is important that it's a matter of raising awareness, but how could you raise awareness on the technology when you should be raising awareness on our consumer behavior? That's what I think is the bigger problem that is facing a less of a modern state, such as Palestine. Maybe you go down to Africa, it's probably the same scenario. It's like, I think the problem isn't like the technology. I think it's about a matter of consumption and that whole capitalist society way of, because the way we use our phones is, I honestly think it's ridiculous. Like, it's not for any good purpose or anything like that. It's more or less to show our behaviors to only Israel. And so I think for the Palestinians, I think more or less it's a matter of raising awareness of how dangerous this is and how dangerous it is to be more consumed in it.
Well, in Canada, we have a very popular storyteller. He's called Stuart McLean, and he tells stories about ordinary Canadians, and they're humorous because ordinary lives are funny. And sometimes when he's telling a story, the audience starts laughing before he's actually got to the funny bit. And he says, "Okay, folks, you're getting ahead of me." And that's exactly what I think of your question. You're getting ahead of me, because I totally agree with you. I haven't said it yet. You're saying it, but I think it's exactly right. And it also reflects my answer to our friend here, because she too was asking about the kind of consumer dimension of this and the ways in, how far do we let ourselves be part of this situation. And I think that's exactly right. We have to recognize that it's not just a surveillance culture, but it's also within the context of a consumer culture, which has already overtaken us, even in the in parts of the world where there is far less disposable income. You don't have to be in a society with a high level of disposable income to find people with consumer mentalities, where consumption is the crucial thing, and where you are supported, where we are supported by the availability of credit, for example. The availability of credit is huge in instant consumption. Oh yeah, I can get that. I'll be able to pay that off in a couple of months' time. I mean, that whole mentality, the whole sense in which consumption is seen as a kind of, it's a lifestyle. It's a way of living. It's a mode of responding to the world. And, in terms of what I was saying about surveillance too, and whether you think of privacy as some kind of individualistic, legal and abstract right, or whether you think of it in terms of relations, human rights, and civil liberties, it's a world of difference. It's very hard to get people with a consumer mentality to think in terms of the other, caring for the other in a human relations context. Very difficult to think in terms of civil liberties. Why should everyone have those same liberties? Very difficult to think in terms of human dignity as the basis for a claim to human rights. So don't imagine for a moment that I wouldn't go exactly down that road, because I think that the kind of surveillance culture as I described it is so closely intertwined with what you might call consumer culture that we have to address both things. So yeah, you're ahead of me. And you're right. And you have another question as well. Now, what have I still got? I'm just looking to see who's here. Don't have anyone who is supposed to be moderate. Oh, there's... How much longer do we have, Lord? I'm just checking, because you said an hour, and I think we're... So we're wrapping up now? Okay. Okay, perfect. Perfect. Let me just see what the question was here. Then you wanted to add something?
I wanted to ask more about the privacy, but we could keep it till next discussion.
We have other times. We don't have to answer all questions today. And in any case, don't look at me to answer all questions, because I don't have all the answers at all. I just know a little bit. And I'll share the little bit that I know, and I also want to learn from you guys, and I'm learning from you guys. So thank you very much for spending time with me this afternoon. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to next couple of weeks together, because It sounds as if there are quite a few things that we want to discuss together. So be thinking of the kinds of questions that you want to ask, and I'm not asking for questions that are sort of academic. What I want to know is how the sorts of things I'm discussing with you touch your lives, you know, here and now in the everyday. Because if the social sciences don't speak to the everyday lives that we live, if they don't speak to flesh and blood realities, if they don't speak to particular kinds of vulnerability, then what use are they? Have a good evening.